Chapter 4, A Thread of Hope. "Oh, this is bad," moaned Tony, shaking his head. "Bad, bad, bad." Sean and the police officer both stood as if frozen, staring at each other across the ever-widening gulf of chocolate-colored water. The police officer turned his head and began speaking urgently into a small radio strapped on his shoulder. Then he scrambled back up the bank, running toward the road. "He's leaving us!" Sean's voice came out, somewhere between a croak and a squeak. "The officer's leaving!" "Where's he going?" said Craig. "Why isn't he helping us?" The boys watched the police officer running to his parked car. By now other cars had stopped along the road. Several people had gotten out and were standing along the road, watching and pointing. The ice floe carrying the boys passed them all. Soon the people standing by their cars were just tiny stick figures in the distance. "Help us!" Tony yelled at them. He turned to Sean. "Why doesn't somebody do something?" "What are they going to do, dive in?" asked Sean sharply. "The water's freezing. You'd die of hypothermia in about 10 seconds. Craig and Tony both looked at Sean. For a long time, the only sound was the gurgling of the river and the snap-crackling of ice along its banks. "But who's going to help us?" whispered Tony. His face had gone very white. Craig was staring at his big brother with an expression that was somewhere between shock and horror. "We're going to drown, aren't we, Sean?" he asked in a low voice. Sean swallowed hard. "Not if we can stay on this ice floe," he told his little brother. "We just have to hold very still and not fall off." But how are we going to get off?" asked Tony. His teeth were suddenly chattering so hard he could hardly talk. "I don't know," said Sean. "Maybe we'll run aground." "We're about to run into something," said Craig, pointing. "But it isn't the ground. Look!" A huge chunk of ice was floating directly into their path. "Hold on!" shouted Sean. "To what?" yelled Tony. "Each other!" said Sean. Huddled in a tight circle, boots braced on the slippery ice, the three boys grabbed each other's arms by the elbows. "Oh, man," said Tony. "Now I know how the Titanic felt." "Here it comes," warned Sean. "Get ready. 3, 2, 1. Crunch! The front corner of the ice floe dipped sharply, sending a wave of freezing brown water sloshing over the boys' boots. Craig yelled as his fleet slipped out from under him. He landed hard on his knees. The ice floe pitched and rolled, sending more water sloshing around their feet. "Whoa!" yelled all three boys. "Hang on!" yelled Sean. He and Tony hauled Craig back to his feet. The ice floe righted itself and resumed its journey downriver, spinning in lazy circles. For a long while the boys said nothing. They just stood, panting and shivering, clinging to each other in silent terror. "Where are we?" asked Tony after a few minutes. "How far have we gone?" Craig raised his head and looked. "We're closer to the Moncton side of the river," he said. "Look, there's the skate park." "What I would give to be on a skateboard right now instead of this stupid hunk of ice," moaned Tony. "Is anybody there?" asked Sean hopefully. "Maybe somebody will see us." "Not exactly skateboarding season, is it?" replied Craig. "Nope, nobody there." The ice floe sailed on. The boys watched in silence as they traveled past the city parking lot, past the library, past the fancy restaurant with the patio lanterns, past the big iron statue of a ship's anchor in Boar Park. But it was a cold day. There was nobody at the park. There was nobody on the riverfront path. Nobody to notice three boys on a tiny chunk of ice, slipping quietly and swiftly between the slick, frozen banks of the Petit Kodiak. "The hotel's coming up," said Sean. "Maybe somebody there will see us." "Wait a minute." Craig cocked his head. "Do you hear that?" "I hear it," said Tony. "It's a siren," said Sean. "It's the police officer," yelped Craig. "He's coming to save us." Just above the riverbank, the boys could see the flashing lights of a police car. Then, as they watched, the car zoomed right past them at high speed. "Hey!" shouted Tony. "Where do you think you're going? We're over here! Come back!" called Craig after the disappearing car. What's he doing, Sean? Didn't he see us? He saw us, said Sean. He also saw that. Look! Tony and Craig craned their heads around to look where Sean was pointing. Up ahead, a finger of ice jutted out from the muddy bank into the river. The police car braked hard and skidded to a halt. The police officer jumped out, scrambled down the bank, and began running out along the finger of ice. He's trying to head us off, said Sean. We're not going to be close enough, said Tony. We're too far out. Up ahead, the police officer waited, standing at the very tip of his icy platform. Tony squinted, shielding his eyes with his hands. He's holding something. A rope, said Craig excitedly. It's a rope. Somewhere in the distance, more sirens were waiting, coming closer. We're saved, whooped Tony. Sean looked around. Their ice floe was drifting out toward the middle of the river. Ahead, the police officer crouched, like a diver on the edge of a diving board, waiting. Sean shook his head. We're not close enough. Sure we are, said Tony. He's got a rope. Ropes are long. We'll catch it and he'll tow us in. It'll work. Tony swallowed hard and peered anxiously ahead. It's got to work. What happens if he misses? Asked Craig quietly. He won't miss, said Tony loudly. Sean didn't say anything. Looking ahead, he saw that past the finger of ice where the officer stood, the Petite Kodiak River widened and then curved sharply away from the city, cutting a brown line toward the empty, windswept marshes. Sean's thoughts drifted back to his classroom at school. Just last week, his class had begun working on their history projects. Lisa Baudru, who sat in front of Sean, was doing her report on the Petite Kodiak River. Miss Gellert, their teacher, had pinned a large map onto the bulletin board. It showed Riverview, Moncton, and Dieppe. A blue, twisty line snaked between Moncton and Riverview and turned a sharp corner at Dieppe. Who can tell me how the Petite Kodiak got its name? Asked Miss Gellert, tapping the twisty blue line on the map. The class exchanged looks. Some kids shrugged their shoulders. Nobody answered. Okay, said Miss Gellert, smiling. Here's a hint. What language do you think the word Petite Kodiak comes from, and why? There was silence for a moment. Then Sarah Marsh, who sat near the front of the room, raised her hand. French? Because it has the word petite at the beginning, and petite is French for little, she said. Very good, Sarah, said Miss Gellert. And what does the shape of the river remind you of? A crooked branch, said Pete Simmons. It kind of looks like an arm, said Lisa. Miss Gellert tapped the spot where the river bent sharply downward. What part of an arm? She asked. The elbow, said Sean. And what is the French word for elbow, class? The class was quiet for a minute, thinking. Le coude, explained Sarah suddenly. She was the best at French. Petite coude, little elbow, chimed in Lisa. The class laughed. It was a funny name for a river. Right you are, said Miss Gellert. French Acadian settlers who lived along the river banks many years ago noticed the river bent like an elbow, and the river was known by them as the Petite Kodiak. But another group of people were also living along the river, a group of people who were there even before the Acadian settlers. The First Nations people, said Pete. Right, said Miss Gellert. The Micmac people also named the river for its funny shape. They called it Petcokoyek, which is known to mean river that bends like a bow. You mean as in bow and arrows? Said Sean. Cool. Exactly, said Miss Gellert. And when the Micmac people told the Acadian settlers the name of their river, the Acadians might have thought they were saying Petite Kodiak, giggled Sarah. Little elbow. It makes sense, said Pete. Both names work. The river does bend like a bow, and it does look like an elbow, too. A wavelet of freezing brown water sloshed over Sean's boot, and suddenly he remembered he wasn't sitting at his desk in a warm classroom anymore. He was on an ice floe in the middle of a very deep, very fast, very cold river. We're going around the bend, said Sean quietly. Tell me about it, said Tony. I'm going to go around the bend if that officer doesn't throw that rope soon. No, said Sean. I mean, we've reached the elbow. What? Said Craig, through chattering teeth. What are you talking about, Sean? Sean tried to explain. If we don't catch the rope, we'll float around the bend in the river. After that, the river heads out across the marsh, away from the city, away from the road. Get it? They won't be able to follow us anymore. We'll be out of reach. Tony and Craig looked at Sean. They looked at the river. They saw the bend. Paddle, said Tony. With what? Yelled Craig. With our hands, yelled Tony. He dropped to his knees and was about to plunge his mittens into the brown water when Sean grabbed him by the shoulders. Don't, Tony. Your fingers will freeze. You'll get frostbite. Yeah, said Craig. I saw a TV show about that once. A mountain climber got frostbite and his fingers turned black and fell off. Tony snatched his hands away from the water. You're making that up. Uh-huh, said Craig, shaking his head. It was really gross. Sean nodded. I saw it too. Discovery Channel. Tony looked worried. My feet are wet, he said. So are mine, said Craig. Mine too, said Sean. The boys looked toward the police officer. Help! They all shouted. The officer waved and yelled something they couldn't quite hear. They were almost level with him. The ice floe was moving fast, sweeping them past the icy banks. Closer and closer they sailed toward the narrow jetty of ice where the police officer stood, waiting for them. Now! Screamed Tony. The officer raised his arm. He swung the rope around and around his head like a cowboy. He let go. The rope snaked through the air toward them. All three boys stretched out their hands. The rope fell short. It landed in the water with a sad little smack. No! Shouted Tony. No, no, no! The ice floe sailed on, past the rope, past the police officer, around the bend.